Thanks everyone for being here today. My name is Thane Chambers. I'm one of the steering committee members for our community of practice. I'm at the University of Alberta, and I live and work on Treaty 6 territory and Métis Region 4. It's great to see so many people here. We were blown away when we saw the number of registrants, which is great. Okay, so I'm going to share the screen. I'm just going to give a brief introduction to our speaker today, and then we'll get the show on the road. Okay, hopefully you can see the slide, I hope. Um, so today we're just going to do the presentation, and then we'll have a Q&A session following that, and then we'll just end by having some brief updates and reminders about what our community of practice has been up to. So I'll just begin by introducing our speaker today, Dr. Stephen McGregor, who I call Steve. So he is an assistant professor of educational leadership, policy, and governance at the University of Calgary's Workland School of Education. His research centers on knowledge mobilization as a mechanism to promote school improvement and systems change, with an emphasis on leadership practices for increasingly complex educational environments. Presently, he focuses on three interrelated strands of inquiry. One, the relational networks among universities and secondary and elementary schools. Two, the influence of positive school leadership on the mobilization of research-informed teaching practices. And three, the mechanism and impacts of co-production as one approach to knowledge mobilization. So that's like the official biography, but I've known Steve, I think maybe we met in 2018 or 2019 when the University of Alberta joined the Research Impact Canada network, and he was doing a postdoc then, I believe, looking at knowledge mobilization. So this really is his area of expertise, and I've done he has many research publications on knowledge mobilization, and I'm really seen him do a lot of work for Research Impact Canada over the few years we've been involved. So I'm so happy he's been willing to talk to us about this really important part of research impact. So I'm going to stop talking and stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to hand things over to Steve.
All right, great. I'm just going to share my screen. Can I just get a thumbs up to make sure that's showing? Okay, perfect. So thank you, and I'm very happy to be here this morning. Well, I guess it's not maybe the morning for everybody who's joining the call, given that we're all across. Is it all across the country? Are we outside Canada as well? It's a really eclectic group. Yeah, so very grateful to be here. I get to talk about the two favorite things for me when it comes to research, which are social networks and knowledge mobilization. But to get started, I wanted to thank the steering committee for organizing this session and extend that to everyone in the BRI community practice for providing this opportunity to share my work. I see social network analysis and knowledge mobilization not just as key themes, but as ways for understanding how we can make research matter more to the people who ultimately could benefit from it, as well as to make community and research partner interests more have greater bearing on the research that we do. So my aim here is to provide a practical introduction to social network analysis, one that's theory informed and includes suggestions about how you can understand social networks in the context of your work. Just a couple of preliminary notes before I jump in here. I may refer to social network analysis just by its acronym SNA, just for brevity, so you don't hear me say that over and over. And knowledge mobilization is KMB. This is just sort of a habit that I'm in. With that, let's just jump right in. So here is the plan. I don't have a ton of time to speak with you because everybody is very busy. I know that from my work with Research Impact Canada, is that everyone who's doing knowledge mobilization always has many things on the go. So here's the plan. I'm going to give a brief overview of why I think you might care about social network analysis in knowledge mobilization. I'll be upfront here. I don't think anyone came to the session hoping to find a way to make their work more complicated. SNA is an exceptionally powerful tool, but I don't think that in all cases it's the best use of resources. As with anything, its utility is situational. And so that's where we'll begin. Why might you use it? And when I think it's particularly beneficial. From there, I'll share some basics about social network analysis. All roads in SNA lead back to a few core concepts, so I'll mention what those are. With those basics in hand, I'll talk through two cases where we used SNA to understand knowledge mobilization processes and outcomes. And although those cases are anchored in my research in K-12 education, I'll draw out what I think are some useful takeaways for everyone here, who understandably may not be immediately concerned with things like how our school uses research. And then I'll conclude just with a few takeaways about SNA and where you could turn next if you find this topic interesting. Okay, so why might you use SNA in your knowledge mobilization work? I think I spent some time thinking about this because I to be honest, and I think probably unsurprising given my research roots, I come at this typically from a research perspective, but I do so much work with groups like Research Impact Canada. I try to put on the practice hat fairly frequently. So in doing so, here's the ways that I think it's useful to people who are on the practice side or who are somewhere in between research and practice. First off, SNA can reveal how information travels within a network. So it helps us visualize and understand the pathway of knowledge flows, which is something I think I'll talk a lot about. And these insights can be really crucial for strategizing how and where to disseminate information or to mobilize it effectively. Additionally, it can help us pinpoint those who hold sway in a network. So knowing who these key players are allows us to collaborate with them for wider reach and impact. Similarly, you might analyze a network to identify potential for collaboration or gaps in collaboration. And so by understanding existing relationships and networks, both in the research and practice space or in policy, we can start to build towards stronger, more effective partnerships, which is something I know many people in the knowledge mobilization space are putting quite a bit of emphasis on. Additionally, it can be used as a method to evaluate impact. And so measuring the impact of efforts in knowledge mobilization is essential. I don't think I need to tell, or I am preaching to the choir in a sense when people here are focused on bibliometrics and research impact. But SNA can provide a before and after analysis of our interventions at the level of relationships. Did a partnership grow in terms of the strength of connections between people, in terms of the number of people who are being reached and influenced by this work? And so it can show us the outcomes of our actions, specifically in the relational world. And then finally, each network has its dynamics. And I think you'll see that from the two examples I'm going to share. SNA helps us tailor the kinds of strategies we use to support the people within those networks so that it better meets the characteristics of their social environment and the individual attributes of the people who live within it. So here's why I think it might matter. And next I'm going to go to what SNA is not. So despite its name, social network analysis is not specifically about studying social network apps or websites. And while those things can certainly include groups that could be studied using social network analysis, SNA encompasses a much larger universe of social environments, those that might be online, in person, or spanning multiple mediums for interaction. Additionally, social network analysis is more than just a set of analytical tools. Even though it's often used that way, it evokes theories and models. It has applications for understanding relationships that emphasize both individual attributes and the social environment. And for me, at least, that's what really draws me to social network analysis. The kinds of questions that I tend to ask about in my research and about how I'm working with my participants tend to come from this side of wanting to understand both the individual and the social world that they're embedded in. And so that's where social network analysis has its strengths. With that, I think generally, so we talked about why network analysis is beneficial. I think it's also useful to maybe spend a second on why focus on networks, because it's even a more general thing. And we all, I think, in some ways use this language quite generally, or maybe to refer to some specific things in our day-to-day work. And so why should we focus on networks? The natural sciences answer is that nature, or if you want to be very grandiose here, the universe seems to organize itself in networks. And whether that be things like feeding relationships among species in an ecosystem, or the neural networks that describe how our brain functions, or even something more fundamental like molecular interactions, we can model those using networks. Similarly, humans seem to organize themselves in networks. And so that would be, in my work, whether, patterns of collaboration among teachers in a school, patterns of friendship among students in a single classroom, or things like policy networks and coalitions. These all have a basis in networks. And once we appreciate the ubiquity of networks, we can also appreciate their importance as an analytical tool. Oh, there we go. So Dr. Stephen Brigatti, one of the leading figures behind the development of the tool set that is SNA, he really outlines two core reasons for examining networks. So I'm going to do the cardinal sin of a PowerPoint presentation and read these because I think they're so important. The first is that an actor's position in a network determines in part the constraints and opportunities that he or she will encounter. And what happens to a group of actors is in part a function of the structure of connections among them. So in other words, social connections impact both the individual and the systems in which they're embedded. So with that background, let's do a quick crash course in the basics of either studying or engaging in network analysis. Okay, so the first piece is our collection of actors. This is fairly intuitive. We start with actors, or nodes, as they might be called, which can be discrete individuals, collective social units. Some common examples in educational research are students in a classroom, departments in a school, teachers in a district. And we use this word actor, not because it connotes this ability to act, but just that it specifies that each social unit here plays a role in the larger social system. Next up, we have ties, which are the connections among our actors. These are the types of ties that we derive from our theoretical or empirical interests. And oftentimes, but not always, we'll make note of directionality like I have here. So for example, who's related to whom? And from there, we have a relation, which is just the collection of all ties of a certain kind among actors in a group. So we might have, who do you go to for advice about teaching mathematics? And here we just have one relationship, but we might be interested in a few different ones. And we may find that by looking at different relationships, it changes the structure of the network entirely. And so from these three bases, or these three elements, we really have the basics of understanding any network. But just two more things, really one more, is that oftentimes we talk about groups, and that's just a subset of actors within a network. It can be as few as two, or really any number. But essentially, it's just a smaller set that we might be interested in, maybe a specific department in a school, if that was my work. And so putting all these things together, we have a network. And I should just note that some actors, such as the one on the top left there on your screen, might be disconnected, which is completely fine. They're still a part of the network, and they actually might be something that we're really interested in if we're looking at how do we reach people who are at the moment not being included in something that's important related to this knowledge mobilization work. Okay, now that's the basics. Like from there, you could, I think, engage with almost anything that has to do with network analysis. But I want you to know two more pieces before I talk with some examples and make everything a little bit more tangible. The first is, we can approach SNA in largely two different ways. The first looks at whole networks. And this is oftentimes what people are familiar with when they're thinking about network analysis. And so we're looking at collecting data from all or as many people as we can who would comprise a network. And the major benefit here, of course, is that we can analyze a network in its entirety. We can provide a complete picture of the relationships and the structures that exist within it. But we do have some challenges. Defining a boundary can be really complex, as well as building a comprehensive roster of who are all the people that we need to talk to understand what this network looks like. A few other things, but the one I'll mention here that's probably the most relevant if someone was thinking about using network analysis is that we typically also have to have a pretty high response rate if we're going to use this for something meaningful in terms of informing our decision making if we're going to use it to use targeted interventions or something like this. Typically we say above 80%, we can be confident that we have a pretty good understanding of the social dynamics that are happening within a network. So within a school or classroom, within a department in a university, these sorts of things. But you might think, okay, those challenges rule this out. So there's another approach we can take, and that's called egocentric. And that's where we're focused on individual people and their immediate personal networks. And so this might just be something you collect through survey data. And it's great. It's a great alternative to sociocentric data collection because we can reach some of the generalizable insights that we're familiar with through surveys. We can say that generally researchers are engaging with these kinds of partners, or that the way that they interact with partners is generally through this kind of interaction, that sort of thing. And we can also get a more we can assuage some concerns that people often have with network data, that I'm naming people that I know. Here, you don't need to do that. You can just have them name, I connect with 5 different kinds of research partners, and we just need to know the kinds of partners they are. But it's still, we have some challenges and or limitations we should consider. The most prominent that I would mention is just that one thing we lose when we go from sociocentric to egocentric is we lose the sense of how does this person fit within the broader social structure that they're embedded in, which may be important to you depending on your work. But this is where my examples are going to live. They're going to be all in the sociocentric, or both. They're going to be in the sociocentric side of things. So I'm going to just talk about 2 examples and show you how this actually comes together in a way that provides some insights. So my first case is from some work that I completed with some colleagues out of the UK, where we asked, how do models of distributed leadership, which is something that's a big focus in educational, the education field, how does it help mobilize research-informed teaching practices? And the setting for our investigation was 3 infant schools that formed a federation in England. It was a type of professional learning network. We had, as I mentioned, a sociocentric approach. We hit the response rate that typically, as I said, you're trying to aim for these to make sure you can say something about a network as a whole. And we were looking at 3 different kinds of interactions. We were trying to figure out who talks with who about the new teaching practices that were being shared with among the schools. We were looking at who went to shared partner professional development activities. And we also wanted to know who was directly trialing and embedding new teaching practices with each other. And so to do that, we had to look at a few different things. We looked at density. That's just the number of connections you see in a network. So you can see in the left example, everyone's connected. So we have a very dense network, whereas on the right there, some of our actors aren't connected at all. And so we would say that's a fairly low density network. And we can measure these things a little bit more specifically, but at a high level, you understand density. That's really the basis of it. As well, we have a fancy term we call centrality, but that really just means how many people are connected to individuals. And so somebody who has 4 people that go to them for advice has a centrality of 4 in degree. And that just means we can look at both the network as a whole in terms of density and individuals in terms of, are they central? Do they play a really key role within their school? All right, now for really the best part of network analysis, which is where you get to generate your network diagrams. This is what we found. It's on its face value, there's not too much that you can draw just from looking at this picture, but it's really interesting once we start to dig into it. So what is it showing? On the legend here on the left, I've got that circles, squares, triangles, and diamonds tell us different kinds of people. Not super important for this analysis, but in case you're interested, you can kind of pinpoint. So where are the school leaders? Where are the teachers? But what is really important are the different schools. And so for this particular network diagram, all I'm showing is conversations. Who talks to who about research-informed practices in this school? And when we try to correlate that with, actually, I'm getting ahead of myself here. When we look at the density, we see that school at the top is doing lots of talking. They're talking to each other a lot about research, and which is great among teachers. We're always happy to see that. And the other two, a little bit less so. But again, we're looking exclusively at conversations. If we shift the picture a little bit, where we say, now let's look at conversations, teachers that are engaging in PD together and that are collaborating together to try and embed new practices in their school, the picture changes pretty drastically. So that school that was initially talking a lot, they're not doing so much when it comes to engaging in all three of these kinds of interaction. And then that school on the right there, the blue, they're doing a lot. And when we looked at the correlation with the kinds of use that they're engaging in, we used a scale to determine, are they in more like, are they using research-informed practices or not? Are they engaging in sort of like more mechanical, not really being flexible with how it works for their school, their local context? Or are they engaging in really expert uses? We found the school that was doing lots of interaction and lots of different kinds of interaction were engaging in those more expert uses, whereas those that school that was really just talking, teachers were just talking a lot, we saw no use, or they were kind of preparing for the use of evidence. So the kinds of interactions we were looking at and the kinds of ways that these teachers were interacting with each other were really illuminating for understanding what we saw as differences in terms of the way that they were engaging with and mobilizing research. What do we get from all this? We found as a big key finding here that expert use was related to how teachers interact. And so less expert uses come from things like conversation, more expert use from more complicated or complex relationships where people are conversing, collaborating, co-participating in events. And yeah, so we extended that a bit, that use is promoted. And we've actually since seen that this tracks when we do studies with researchers and with other groups, that useful or meaningful engagement with evidence comes from, use of research is when promoted when teachers meaningfully engage with the innovations that are being shared through the schools, when they're trialing new practices and sharing what their experiences are with their colleagues, and when they continue to use and refine what they're doing in an ongoing way. And so that's what we found in one case. In our second case, we did something entirely different. And we asked, how did direct and indirect brokering activity involve in a multi-district network? So here we're looking at actually two entirely different districts in Southern California. We were interested in how is an intervention that was happening in those schools improving the elementary to middle school transition for students learning mathematics. We had a sociocentric approach again, but this time we were looking at just the people who were really involved in the initiative. So it was about 58. And we wanted to know, who are they seeking advice from? Who are they sharing ideas with? What were they doing to differentiate their learning supports? And what kind of materials were they sharing? So we were looking at completely different relationships, and this was a longitudinal study. So we asked, we went and looked at these relationships in 2016, and then again in 2018 at the end of the initiative. And so two things are important here in the way that we tried to understand this network. First being, we wanted to understand how knowledge was moving through different people. And so on the one hand, we had this idea of network activity. That's the two boxes at the bottom there. You might be sharing information directly with people. Like I might go to Thane when I have a question of a bibliometrics question that I'm not sure the answer to. And so that would be a direct connection. Or Thane might know of somebody who could connect me with that kind of information. And so in that case, we're going through an indirect connection. And then we had this other concept at the top there called utility. And that just meant, do I go to a certain person for multiple kinds of information? So maybe I go for advice and I go for materials, or some combination of those other relations I had mentioned. So just, do you go to each other for multiple things? This is called, if you want to get real technical, multiplexity. And that just means, it's a fancy term for saying multiple kinds of relations. So we don't ever have to just look at one. And so we said it's an indicator of, is this a meaningful relationship? If I just go to you for advice, that might mean that it is. But if I go to you for multiple things, then it has a sense of being more meaningful to both of us. So what do we find? Another network diagram. Again, this is like the best part of network analysis. I don't expect anyone to look at this and just immediately understand what it's saying. But I'll sort of lead you through what it is trying to communicate here. So off to the side, our legend, noting that we're representing our two districts here. So quite literally the left and right side of the screen. And three different types of actors. So we had teachers, instructional coaches, school leaders. And the size of the actors or nodes here is completely just related to their in degree centrality. How many people go to them? So we can see somebody like the person that I've labeled A is really important because a lot of people seem to go to this person to think, how do we support students in learning mathematics? Person B, not so much. Not a lot of people go to person B. So that's just a difference that we saw at time one. Time two, nothing really changed. Person A, still very important for people going directly to them. Person B, still relatively sort of in the middle or a little bit less important. And so we're starting to understand who are the key individuals that we could target for interventions to try and promote the sharing of best practices around supporting students in that middle school to, or elementary to middle school transition. The story changed completely though, when we didn't look at just who goes to somebody directly for information, but who serves as a conduit, who connects people. When we look at that picture, A becomes basically insignificant. We can't even see them anymore. But that person B at time one, they start to show a little bit more importance, as well as some other people in that, on the right there is our secondary school. And when we look at time two, after the intervention, 2 years had passed, person B has grown into this incredibly influential broker of information. They don't directly share a lot of research, but what they do is they connect people who can use interventions. And so we gain something, we learn something here by not looking at only who's directly connected, but also who can share things with each other really effectively. And so this was the power of our network analysis. We were able to think about the kinds of interventions that then followed from this initial 2-year run. And now this graph is really nerdy because I nerded out over it for a long time and I thought it was great. It's complicated looking, but what it showed and what we were really excited for it to show was that teachers, despite what a lot of people often think in the research who didn't do a network analysis of this kind of phenomenon, teachers are probably the most important for sharing information. Although we often think about bringing in external people into schools to provide professional development, we found that the Bs there, B1 and B2, were the most influential. They engaged with lots of different kinds of brokering activity, and that utility scale on the bottom, all the way on the right where it says 4, that means they were engaged in all 4 kinds of relations that we were looking at. And so they were doing lots and lots of work to make sure that people in their school could embed the kinds of research-informed practices that this intervention was focused on. So what did we find? Big takeaway. The programming was neither static nor unidimensional. And so we could see by looking at those different kinds of network diagrams that both direct and indirect network interactions are essential for understanding things like knowledge brokerage or mobilization. So we shouldn't ever just have a sort of myopic focus on just one. As well, the depth, or what we call relational embeddedness in a network, is really important. So it's not just enough to say, go look at who's going to who for advice, but also to see potentially things like who confides in who, or who is somebody's go-to person. Like these kind of different relations tell us different things about the network. And for us, a really key finding was that the position of brokers was always changing. And so what we saw across the 2 years is that somebody who might be really important in year 1 in terms of getting information out to people might not be so important in years 2, 3, or 4 if we're looking across a multi-year project. We should always be thinking about how is the social space changing and how does that change the kinds of ways that we could interact with it. So key takeaways from these, because I know I threw some pretty complex looking diagrams at you, and I'd like to just distill what I think are some key messages here. So first, when we look across these studies, as well as the larger body of literature with regard to network analysis, meaningful interactions are critical for promoting knowledge mobilization. And so the point here, or this point up here, is supported by the work of a lot of different scholars who do work in social network analysis and knowledge mobilization. But I think there's an opportunity to be more specific about what meaningful means in the context of promoting knowledge mobilization. So in our work, we find that that meaningful often means going beyond conversations. So it involves people working together and actually trying to understand what that looks like. As well, building on that last point, a question that we're engaging with more critically is the medium through which people interact. And so in relation to promoting, for example, more inclusive practices, through some research that one of my colleagues is engaging in, what we find is that when people are, what people are saying is that the manner in which they're engaged with each other was really critical when considering how practices or research was mobilized. So in the work I presented today, we're asking, what assumptions are we making about different mediums? And I think this, the point that I was leading to that's salient here is that an increasing amount of what we do is moving online, including how we interact, in some cases how we teach, if in my area. And so we should be thinking about the ways that different people are interacting, the time scales that we could expect that would be reasonable for people to interact in. And then lastly, context is everything. And so such as, we're seeing here, the ways that we think about the people and the social environments they're embedded in, the way they talk about sharing knowledge and past interactions, it includes the social, the cultural, the institutional settings where interactions take place. And yeah, I would say it's, when it comes to knowledge mobilization, an appreciation of context must just resound with everything that we do. I think the simple truth is that if we wish to be influential, we must know who and what we're trying to influence. And so a couple of caveats just before I close out. I think I'm pretty close to my time here. If you're interested in using network analysis, I think there's a few things that you should certainly be aware of. First is, as we had mentioned at the beginning, that social network or sociocentric approach, which is where you're doing the whole networks, you want a high response rate. And so that means trying to talk to as many people as you think are important within the network that you're setting out. But just as we define the network, we define the boundary. So as soon as you say, I'm going to look at who seeks who for advice in this research network, that's going to give you a certain sense of what is that network. And drawing a boundary can be really difficult because, when we declare interest in the connections among a specific group of people, we have to overcome the fact that we rarely find that we can clearly demarcate where it's not important to say, continue to include others. And so oftentimes it's arbitrary, but we sort of need to set it at, maybe it's within the local city context or local regional context, that sort of thing. And yeah, if you're interested in any of this, there's lots of tools. So you might, if you're interested in just producing really interesting and useful graphics, not getting into so much of the sort of analytics of things like I mentioned, density and centrality, Gephi is a great tool. It's completely free. UCINet is kind of, if you're familiar at all with SPSS, it's kind of like the SPSS of social network analysis. It's really easy to use, but I don't think it's free, but it's relatively inexpensive. And then, of course, if you're very sophisticated, which is a level beyond me, then you might even go to R, which is sort of the most bleeding edge, but you need to know R. And the last thing I'll share is just a couple of resources that, if any of this strikes an interest with you, a few things I'd recommend. Analyzing Social Networks, it's by Stephen Borgatti and colleagues, and it's an excellent book, a really easy introduction into the topic. Egocentric network analysis, that's going to focus more on, like I mentioned, individuals' networks and what we can do to make sense of those. And then if you have any interest in education, I love this book, Social Network Analysis in Education. It's fantastic introduction by Brian Carolyn. And again, a very much an easy introduction to understanding how do you use it? How do you make sense of it? And I would be very happy to take any questions. Or if you want to take some time to let some of these things percolate, please don't hesitate to reach out. I love talking about anything network analysis and knowledge mobilization.
Great. Thank you so much. That was excellent presentation. And I know a lot of us in this call do social network network analysis in our bibliometric work, but we don't usually use people. We use publications and see how publications are connected through citations. So this is I think this is really interesting to see how we can actually use this type of analysis for real people, which are who move around, don't stay in one spot, unlike our publications. If there's any questions, feel free to raise your hand or also to put them in the chat.